The first group of general template tags that we're going to look at are include tags, and we've actually seen a number of these before. For example, the first couple ones of get header, footer, and sidebar are ones that we've already seen when we were working with template files, since because we needed them to include our template files, we've already used them. We've also already looked at some of the parameters that are possible with them, but we'll take a deeper look at that in a moment. We've also already worked with get template part, and we know how to pass parameters into that. We even looked very, very briefly at get search form, and comments template should make sense to pull in the comments template for a particular page. Now let's look at the documentation for each of these so we can get a little bit better understanding of how each one works, and then understand later when we go need to look up something that we have some comfort looking around and understanding how this documentation is laying things out. So coming back over to our complete list of template tags and coming down to the general tags, we could see that we have these include ones logged together here up at the top. And let's just open up get header and take a look at what it has here. Now, the first thing to point out in documentation like this is we have the name of the function, and then we have any parameters that are going to be passed into it. It tells us here that this is what we're going to pass in as a string of text. So as opposed to a Boolean value of true, false, or opposed to something like a number, it needs a string of text inside of quotation marks. And then the name of this used is actually name. And then finally, it has a default value of null. So if we come down under parameters here, we could see that there is one parameter, name, which is type of a string. It tells us that it's optional, and its default value is null. This is going to be the name of the specialized header. And we know that as we've used it before, if we pass in a name, like if we passed in special, that would link to the header template header-special.php. We could also see in the documentation the source code. So if you are a bit more of a developer or you're curious what is happening inside any of these functions, you could look at that. And finally, in the bottom, we'll find a section for user contributed notes, which sometimes has information and sometimes doesn't, but it may give you some examples of how you could use the specific template tag you're looking at, or of other things that you might not know that might be helpful to know about. So if we were to briefly come back in and look at get footer, we would see that it has the exact same setup. And if we were to look at get sidebar, we'd see it has the exact same setup and functions there. So this should begin to make sense as you look through these. Let's look at the next one, get template part. Now we see that this is a little bit different. Notice that it has a string of slug being passed in, and then it has a string of name, which is equal to null. And when we come down here, we could see that slug is passed before, and then the name would be special, and it tells us what all of these are as well. We could also see that slug in this case is required. So what that means is that we absolutely have to pass in some sort of slug to start it off, which we already know from looking at get template part. Then we have get search form, another one of them. And if we come down, or I'm sorry, right up here, we could see that it's got whether it should be echoed as a Boolean value. This is a true or false, and it defaults to true. So what we could do is pass in an optional value and set it to false, and then it would just get the search form for us, and it wouldn't echo it out. Now, the last one we had here was called comments template, and if we search around, it's not actually here, but if we were to come up and search through the general function reference, we would find it listed under the general functions in WordPress, and it is inside the comment template.php file. So it is there, but it's not actually listed on that page. So I'm pointing this one out to you as a little bit extra. So let's take a look at how this works. With comments template, we could see that there is a string of a file being passed, and then there's a Boolean option of whether to separate comments, true or false. So it gives us a description here, and it says that if we pass it a file, we will get that, although that could be filtered for later on, which is something that we know. And we know that by default, it's going to look for a comments.php. So this is an optional string. And then it's also optional whether to separate the comments by comment type, which defaults to false. So one thing is that if you want to pass in a parameter that comes after the first one. So let's say we just wanted to pass in a parameter for this, but not for this one. What we could do is pass null or empty strings for file, comma, and then this one. Since if you want to pass in the second parameter, you also need to pass in the first, but it's possible to pass in a null value. So comments template may be a little bit out of place here. We'll mention again in comments, but in some listings you will see this listed here, and it is a bit of an include file, so I'll mention it in this section. So what I would suggest you do at this point is a little bit of practice. We're going to do a bigger, more official practice after we look at all of the different general template tags, but you know these and you should be comfortable building something. So let me give you the suggestion of build a completely new site from scratch. I know you've already gone through this process and it could be super simple. All it should really need is a header, footer, sidebar, index, maybe a template part content, and try to use each one of these and look up the function, understand how it works, and play around with building a little something that uses each one of these. Now you're going to have to do this eventually, so I suggest you start now and play around before going into the next lesson. And then in the next lesson, we will look at using some of the login tags.